Today, I'm going to be focusing largely on sort of the places in which the home front and the battlefronts meet, in the American Revolution, sort of collapsing those distinctions that we think of when we tend to think about wartime spaces. Now, when we have traditional ideas about military engagement in the Revolution and the war front, it often looks like this, right? It's often focused on George Washington, military leaders, military engagement, but what happens if we shift our gaze and we actually think about the places and people that were in the middle of all of these military conflicts, right? That these battlefields are not these neatly demarcated spaces, right? They are often like literally in someone's backyard, right? And that means somebody is living there, somebody is experiencing that, someone is being disrupted by the effects of war. And that is, particularly true, in New Jersey, right? I found this wonderful quote. It's not a New Jersey quote, but I loved it so much. It's from a new book called The Home Front by a scholar by the name of Lauren Duvall. It's absolutely fabulous work, right? And this is talking about very early in the war, and it's Mercy Otis Warren, who's a famous author, and she is writing to a friend, and the friend, Hannah Winthrop, had to be displaced, right? There was, the British were coming, and she had to leave her home relatively quickly, and that was such a common experience for so many women and children and families during this time. But I loved Warren's reflections on this process, right? Where she says, I cannot give an idea of the reflections that arose in my mind when I consider your happy roof, once the residence of calm philosophy, now occupied by the boisterous sons of Mars, right? So setting up this contrast between the home as the haven versus now it's a military space, right? Instead of music, and harmony, there is now nothing to be heard in this one happy retreat but the din of arms and the shrill clarion of war, right? And I think this quote is so beautiful. She's a writer, she's a brilliant way of expressing herself, but because it gets exactly to the main point of my talk today, right? Which is how those boundaries between home and war were often very blurred and very messy during the American Revolution, and particularly right here in New Jersey, which was home to so many troop movements, so many military engagements, so many encampments, right? Home and war remained inextricably connected throughout the long years of the war, throughout the entire, state. I just love this map because, as someone who promotes New Jersey history, I'm an editor of a book series, right? This is a map from the Revolution from 1777 that refers to New Jersey as the country between New York and Philadelphia, right? Like we often do not get our proper, respects, right? But it speaks to New Jersey as the crossroads of the Revolution, right? So much is happening, between New York, which is a key military outpost for the British, and then Philadelphia, which had been occupied by the British for ports of the war, right? So all of this, movement of troops and supplies and peoples throughout the war. This area between New York and and Philadelphia was incredibly busy throughout the entire war. And so what I'm hoping, to sort of really emphasize today is this sort of duality, right? To sort of blur our visions a little bit and think about all of the ways in which armies occupy domestic spaces, right? Warren's quote about, the happy home being now the theater of Mars, but also the way in which women enter military spaces, right? So I'm going to talk a little bit about both of those movements, throughout my talk today. What I'm not going to talk about is like the Battle of Trenton itself, right? I am not a military historian. People in this audience probably know more about the actual military, maneuverings than I do, right? So, but that's not my focus. What my focus is to remind us that the Battle of Trenton, again, is not taking place in some far off, neatly cordoned off battlefield. It's taking place, right in the middle of Trenton, right? It is taking place right where people are living and working. And I have found some wonderful sort of images that really bring that to bear. This is a great sketching. It was actually made by a Hessian a person who was here during the Battle of Trenton, sort of sketching out sort of where the various encampments were, kind of helps to remind us again that this was happening, right here in people's homes. In early December 1776, when British and Hessian troops first arrived in Trenton, many residents fled their homes. And I was just really struck by this. You should buy these cards, Trenton Eyewitnesses to Revolution, right? Available for sale right here. And this is the story of a woman, Mary Barnes. Her husband left town when the armies were approaching. He was a loyalist. I guess he didn't want to, be caught here. So he went to join the Loyalist 1st Battalion of the New Jersey Volunteers to fight with the British, leaving her to take care of the house. Right? So imagine that. War is coming. We're in this period of incredible uncertainty. Your husband has gone off to fight, and you're now facing an army, right? Much of the houses and homes and businesses in Trenton were then occupied by Hessian and British soldiers, right? Either the homes were completely emptied because people had hightailed it out of here, or, and I'm assuming that, that there was British occupation. There's also later American occupation, right? And that gets to really one of the key things. So much of the war, whether willingly or not, people's homes became military encampments, right? Whether it was for a few days or for several months, right? You had generals, officers staying in the homes of people. Now, sometimes this was a mutual arrangement. I'll talk about a few examples of that. But other times it was just, the army showed up and said, hey, your house is now our headquarters, right? And how, disrupting that would have been for women in particular, especially if they were the ones sort of left a home alone to deal with these. So when I was looking at some visual images, and these are all later paintings of the Battle of Trenton, right? They're not like from 1776, right? But what I was immediately struck by is how the paintings show the battle is taking place, right there, right in the middle of the street, as it were, right? And that's so important to remember, right? So just imagine what it would be like to be living in one of these homes, right? Either you have had to fled with relatively little notice and little, time to prepare, just, trying to, and hopefully you had someplace safe, relatives or someone, near enough that you could get to escape the impending troops, or you had to have, troops occupying your house who may or may not have shared your political allegiance, right? And then, there's all of these stories from Trenton, like people's homes, just like shot up with cannonball and stuff, right? Like we're literally in the crossfires, right? Trent House right here experiences, the effects of war up close and personal. This actually, the story is on this board as well. I got it from that fabulous website that was being plugged before, right? In the early days of the leading up to the Battle of Trenton, the home was at the time owned by a Dr. William Bryant, who had worked for the British, right? But we're not sure whether he was or wasn't a loyalist, right? But in any case, his house, like many other homes in Trenton, was occupied by Hessian troops at the time, right? Very familiar story. By 1778, the property was purchased by Colonel John Cox, who was an ardent patriot. And by 1781, as American troops are making their way to Yorkton, they are using the house and its grounds as encampments, right? So we have this really rich evidence of even the ground we are standing on right now is sort of directly, affected by this crossroads of the American Revolution. There's also this fabulous diary by a Quaker woman who was living in Burlington, sort of down the road, right? And she tells the story of sort of what's happening, right before and right after the Battle of Trenton, from the experience of someone who was sort of seeing and experiencing all of these troop movements happening, literally right in her backyard, right? So it starts with sort of rumor in early December, right? Person was here from Philadelphia, and they told me that people were in great commotion, that the British fleet was in the river and hourly expected, to sail up to our city, right? And so people immediately have to start making decisions. Do I stay? Do I leave? Where do I go if I go? Like, we're safe, right? A few days later, the actual troops do arrive, right? And so Morris tells the story about how around 10 o'clock in the morning, a party of about 600 men marched down the main street of Burlington. And they, pass along. They tell the town doctor and some other persons that a large number of Hessians are also going to be advancing and would be in town, in less than an hour, right? So this is weeks before the Battle of Trenton, where no one knows that there's going to be a Battle of Trenton, right? So every day people are like, well, where is this going to happen? How many troops are going to show up? So disruptive for the women and families who were, experiencing this up first and personally. And then after the war, or after the battle, Morris tells the story about sort of the immediate aftermath. So on the 27th, right after the Battle of Trenton, she tells about how 300 members of the Pennsylvania militia come back, to Burlington after the battle, right, and are being quartered by the inhabitants. Again, how much of this is willingly and how much of this is just, you are now quartering soldiers, right? And so over the next week, she tells us a lot about what that experience would be like. It's such a great primary source, right? So on the 29th, she talks about how even more soldiers arrived. They took possession of the next house, and how the inhabitants of the town are now needing supplies. There's not enough bread, there's not enough firewood, right? That they're stretched thin. They did not expect to have thousands of troops, sort of landing on their doorsteps. And this seems to be only one of the many calamities of war, she wrote, right? So again, this is not the battlefield itself. This is not direct military engagement, but this is how disruptive it was for women to suddenly have to share their homes, their resources, their provisions with thousands of troops who wind up, in their homes and in their streets, right? And just the very next day, she talks about how soldiers are brought in and that women expected to take care of them, right? And talks more about how difficult it was to procure wood for the soldiers, how the wagons that they would have used were also being sort of, impressed to sort of carry soldier supplies, right? So this is just one example of many that we can see happening throughout the state, throughout the many long years of the war, across the nation as well. I'm trying to keep my talk as much as possible focused on New Jersey history, right? Because again, as I mentioned earlier, it is in New Jersey where women, more so than other parts, experience those direct effects of the war, the occupation of their homes, the outright confiscation, the destruction or vandalization of their homes. Oftentimes that those supplies that are given to troops are given freely and willingly as acts of goodwill. Sometimes they are compensated. But just as often, they are just, pillaged or plundered, right? Troops will come into areas and just take what they need, and there's no recourse or no compensation. And in fact, troops on both sides often deliberately engage in raiding parties, like Washington up in Bergen County, where I'm a little bit more familiar with from some northern New Jersey, right? Deliberately sends parties out to areas that are known to be loyalist strongholds, and then and the British do the same, to areas that are patriot. And when that happens, crops and livestock and clothing and their silver, curtains, everything is sort of up for grabs and often taken in very sort of violent, violating ways, right? And so there's a lot of stories about women, experiencing these disruptions, and then even after the war, trying to, claim some compensation for what had been lost and damaged as a result of all of this troop movement throughout the state. The other thing I want to talk about are those moments in which a home becomes a military headquarters, right? To think about how completely disruptive it would be to have your home suddenly having to share it with officers and soldiers and their servants and their messengers and who else decides to show up. How completely disruptive this would be to a family's routines. And again, it's women and children who are often sort of directly experiencing this, because oftentimes the men of the house are either off fighting or otherwise absent, or maybe have passed away from the war, right? And so it's a really just so dramatically shows how those boundaries between home and war completely collapse during the war. really fascinating and really makes us think about, wartime spaces in new ways. And I'm just going to give you a couple of examples from New Jersey, right? One is from Morristown, New Jersey. You can go today, right, to the Morristown National Park and visit Ford Mansion, right, which was used as General Washington's headquarters during the winter of 1779 and 1780 while the Continental Army was there. Now, Theodosia Ford was a war widow, right? Her husband had been a patriot. He died, I think, in 1777. She willingly gave her house to Washington and his entourage, because her husband had been a patriot, she was a patriot. I don't really think she knew what she was getting herself into, right? Remember, I think it was Benjamin Franklin that says, like, after 3, you want to get rid of the fish and the house guests, right? Washington stays for 6 months, right? And pretty much takes over the entire house. I mean, Theodosia Ford is living there with 4 of her children at the time, and pretty much, and it's not a small house, right? It's a pretty nice house, right? It's called, Ford's Mansion now, right? He takes over almost the entirety of the house except for a couple of rooms that Theodosia, has to share with her 4 young children and then whatever, servants would have been in the household with her. And this is an image from the Ford Mansion, which is under the National Historic Park Service, that just kind of shows how cluttered these living spaces would be, right? So instead of having to have a separate dining room and a separate living room and a separate bedroom, basically, she's living in a studio apartment, right, in New York, or the equivalent, the 18th century equivalent of one, right? Like, all of the house has to be completely repurposed, and those separate spaces, and particularly, like, the Fords were rather elite, rather wealthy, so their house would have been this very sort of way of signaling their class and status. There would have been a parlor, there would have been a dining room, there would have been a grand hall, there would have been all these spaces that were meant to signify the wealth and particular social activities. To have all of them sort of, collapsed into one room where she was expected, to entertain, to have her meals and to sleep with her children all within a, pretty tight quarters, had to be incredibly disruptive for the family. And again, 6 months, right? Even Washington himself sort of recognizes this, because he is traveling with an entire entourage between his aides de camp, his servants, Martha Washington comes to visit and stay with him for the encampment. He's got his lifeguards, his security force with him. There's probably troops encamped right outside the house, right? And even he acknowledges that, Mrs. Ford and her family are all crowded together, and all of them have caught cold and are sort of miserable in their own houses, right? And I will say that, then there's she actually afterwards tries to sort of get some compensation for this. She sort of writes to the army you were here a long time, you kind of broke my, he basically made renovations on her house and everything. So she was So you can see how maybe this was not the most ideal arrangement for all involved, right? Now, another site that I'm much more familiar with is up in northern New Jersey, Dye Mansion. It's only 10 minutes away from William Patterson University, where I teach. It also served as Washington's headquarters. Tunis Dye, who was a member of the New Jersey militia, an ardent patriot, and his wife Hester seemed to sort of welcome Washington. He stayed for a shorter time. Maybe that's what made it easier, 2 months first, and then for another month later on. The house is located in what is now Wayne, New Jersey. There was no Wayne, New Jersey back in the day. There wasn't even a Passaic County back in the day, so it would have been considered just all sort of part of Bergen County. But I love this map that I found from 1781 showing, the northern parts of New Jersey. At least New Jersey actually gets named as New Jersey here. And you can even see that in a map that is sort of laying out the landscape, the river works, the ways of, traveling. Tunis Dye's home is actually singled out as a key spot on this map. And I kind of put the arrow there so you can see it right above Little Falls, right? And we even have the military correspondence right before Washington does set up his headquarters there, reporting that they have found, a position most convenient for an army on the road, right? That, that this is centrally located. It's close to Morristown, it's close to Ramapo, sort of easy to maneuver with. There's waterways, there's, mountains in the background. It's very strategically located. And so, as I said, Washington is there for 2 months in the summer and then comes back for another month in the fall. This is an image that, courtesy of Dye Mansion, it's in their private collection, right? And I love it because it sort of shows, sort of, it's a 19th century sort of illustration of what, the headquarters might have looked like that summer. But if you kind of look closely, you can even see this 19th century illustrator did include at least one woman there. Right? A very important reminder that, Hester Dye would have been living in this house with at least a couple of her children. The Dye family story is actually really fascinating because one of her daughters is a loyalist. It's a really fascinating story, but I won't get into all of that now. But what we also know is that this was a military headquarters, right? It would have been, again, really disruptive for the Dye family to have Washington move in. In the Dye family case, it was, I think, a little bit more hospitable for everybody involved. I don't know if anyone's ever been up to Dye Mansion in Wayne, New Jersey. Make it a field trip. It's a fabulous spot. They do tours, they do lectures, they do all sorts of events. It's a beautiful, Georgian, mansion. So it was also known as Bloomsbury, which is interesting. I guess that's like the name everybody wants to name their houses in the 18th century. But it's pretty much divided in half with this really, majestic hall. And so Washington takes half of the house, and the Dye family are given the other half. And so it's still crowded and disruptive, but maybe a little less so than, poor Theodosia Ford, cramped into just a couple of rooms. And we also have some compelling evidence. This is from Jane Varick, a family member, who describes, going to October 1780 to the Dye family house, where she was, quote, surrounded by my headquarters acquaintances. And I love this because it kind of reminds us that, again, Washington had an entire entourage with him, Alexander Hamilton, you name it. There were all these aides de camp. There were all of these, there's a whole bodyguards, servants, messengers coming in and out. They hosted a dinner for a French diplomat, right? It was a very busy time, but it was also a time where there would have been some moments for socialization, right? For the people in the house to interact with the soldiers. There's actually like a couple of weddings that take place afterwards, right? There is, space and time, for socializing, and particularly in the winter encampments where there, wasn't a lot of fighting to be done and just sort of hunkering down. We also know, now we don't have any evidence that Martha Washington came to Dye Mansion when George Washington was there, but we do know that Martha Washington pretty much spent half of the war traveling to be with George Washington, right? That she was probably at his various encampments as often as she was home in Mount Vernon. And her presence and the presence of other military officers, Lucy Knox, Colonel Knox's wife, was also frequently in the encampments. This was really symbolically important to the war effort, right? Because if Martha Washington and other officers' wives were willing to go out of their comfort of their own homes and go to the encampments and make this sacrifice to be with the troops, to show their support, it was a way of boosting morale for the troops. And some of those winters, the troops really did need some boosting of their morale. And there was also a political element to this as well, right? Washington was constantly entertaining members of Congress, either asking for, usually asking for more supplies, more money, right? He was trying to, strategize with other military leaders. He was trying to gain, foreign support, so there's all these French visitors coming as well, and the ability to sort of create not just sort of moments for diplomatic discussions, but to sort of prove this was a cause worth fighting for, right? That this was a place that was worthy of either Congress's support or foreign support. The way to do that would be to sort of have a nice dinner, have a nice dance, have a ball, have a tea party, right? To sort of blend the socializing with the more diplomatic aims of the negotiations, right? And I'll just give you one example of a ball that was held in 1779 right here in New Jersey to celebrate our official alliance with France, right? And so one of the people who were at this encampment at the time in 1779 talk about how there was this huge ball. I think 400 people attended, right? With fireworks, right? And with a splendid ball that was opened by none other than George Washington himself, who danced with General Knox, Lucy Knox, who was sort of the belle of the sort of encampment scene, very young, beautiful, vivacious woman, right? So again, we might not expect to see a ballroom dance, right? A tea party, a formal dinner party happening in the theater of war, But this was so common because, again, that's how you get the war to be successful. It's not just what's happening on the battlefront. It's making sure that you have the supplies you need, the money you need, the troops you need, the foreign support you need, right? And all of that is done through this space of, sort of social diplomatic relations that requires, especially when we're trying to court, France and other European alliance, right? They are expecting something that's going to resemble the courts of Europe and stuff. So it's to the extent possible that Washington and his encampments are able to have women present there and have these elaborate social settings, it is really essential for, garnering support for the war. It's often not recognized as crucial military support, but it really is. There's, especially for the French, it's hard to say that they would have put their support behind the Americans if they weren't sort of convinced that this American enterprise, was worth fighting for and worth, aligning with, right? Now, what I want to focus almost the rest of my talk on are the experiences of women who are collectively known as camp followers. If you are an officer's wife, Martha Washington, Lucy Knox, you are willingly in the camp. You're often enjoying, pretty relatively nice quarters, right? You're staying in someone's home that's been commandeered, as a military encampment, right? But so much of the support of the Army took place in a less glamorous way, right? The thousands of women who traveled everywhere the Army went, who helped and assisted the Army by cooking their meals, by sewing, by laundering those dirty uniforms, right? By tending to the sick and engaging in all of the other essential services that would need to support the troops. Again, there was no military apparatus per se, like we think of the modern military today, right? They're kind of making it up as they go, right? And so much of this is being done by women, right? Now, on my way down here, I passed the Molly Pitcher rest area, right? She's sort of, one of the legends of the American Revolution. Scholars have indicated that she may have been inspired by this woman, Mary Hayes Macaulay, who was with her husband at the Battle of Trenton. So Mary Hayes would have been, a camp follower. But she's really a composite figure, right? She's really a representative figure of the thousands of women, and we don't know exact numbers, right? But historians estimate for the American troops anywhere from like 3,000 to 10,000 women might have traveled with the Continental Army, throughout the course of the war. Now, Macaulay herself, we know her story, and which is why we think it might be, she might be a good case for representing Molly Pitcher, that she actually later applied for and successfully received a pension from the state of Pennsylvania for the services that she rendered in this Revolutionary War, right? And we have a lot of other evidence about these women camp followers that's often been sort of hidden in plain sight. And so I have a couple of fascinating images that I want to share with you, and some military orders as well, to kind of show that what we no, and it kind of reminds me of the recovery work that you're doing here at Trent House, right? Like the people and the stories, it's always there. It's just sort of hidden or harder to get to. And sometimes these stories are hidden in plain sight. And that's what I love about some of the materials that I was able to uncover in preparing for this talk. Now, I should note that as opposed to those officers' wives who were there because they wanted to support their husbands, they were invited, they were welcomed, they had means to travel, most women who served as camp followers did so out of economic necessity, right? They just had no way of supporting themselves if their husbands were off fighting, or they might have suffered displacement, right? They might have been pushed out of their homes might have been occupied or destroyed, by the British, there are plenty of economic and sort of physical reasons why women really felt that they had no choice but to follow the Army, right? So, just kind of reminding of us this, right? There's been some wonderful research done on the experiences of camp women. This is actually a picture from Dimension. I've done a lot of work with them. They sometimes hold these sort of reenactment things, and I love that they include the experiences of camp followers as well as soldiers and everything else. So Holly Meyer, who's written an entire book on the experiences of camp followers, and other scholars, suggest that there's an average of one woman for every 35 soldiers in the Continental Army. Now this, fluctuates throughout the war, but just to kind of give one specific data point that kind of matches this, there's a census of camp followers from West Point that sort of notes about 150 women and children, because again, often women are traveling with their families, or they're getting pregnant and giving birth, as they go, alongside the 3,000. And so that kind of pretty much matches the sort of research that Meyer and others have come up with. So I want to share a couple of fabulous images. This is from West Point, right? This is you can find this at the Museum of the American Revolution online. It's one of the few actual images we have from 18th century encampments, right? Not somebody imagining what the Battle of Trenton was like 100 years later, but somebody on the spot in 1782, made this sketch. And then if you look at it, kind of shows the encampment over West Point. If you've ever been up there, it's actually very beautiful. But if we start to notice that the artist has incorporated the experiences of camp followers. They are literally these shadowy figures that are hidden in plain sight in the historical record, right? So we see one tending a campfire. Presumably she is holding a pot or something, so she presumably is making meals for the troops. And then you see a couple of other women off in the distance as well. So their presence is there, right? We have this wonderful visual record. And then if we dig through the military records, and this is so much easier to do now than it would have been 30 years ago, because a lot of these records have now been digitized and they're searchable. Founders.org in particular has all of the correspondence of Washington and stuff. So you can kind of do these key code word searches. And I just, did that to help prepare for this talk, just to find you some examples of how, again, the experiences and the presence of these camp followers are just sort of everywhere in the historical record if you sort of know where and how to look for them. So these are a couple of examples from an encampment that took place in Middlebrook, New Jersey, right? And just sort of little notes, right? A proportionate number of women to the sick of each regiment should be sent to the various hospitals to attend the sick as nurses. So that little matter-of-fact note tells us how matter-of-fact it would have been to have women serving, helping to tend to the sick. And then on the same campaign, we have additional orders that talk about how they're, the army, the troops are about to march out, for some military engagement, but that all tents, baggage, and women should be left in camp, right? And again, these sort of notes, I was digging through Founders Online, there's dozens and not hundreds of them where we just sort of see these little snippets of information presented so matter of fact. This is not something that's exceptional. It's not talked about oh my God, I can't believe there are women here, right? It's just this sort of matter of fact recording of this everyday sort of ubiquitous presence of women within the Army, right? Now, women who served as camp followers typically received rations. There was some debate over the numbers and stuff. I'll kind of talk very briefly about that. And sometimes they were often also paid, not from the Army. So sometimes women were paid for nursing or things like that. But often it was more like a group of soldiers would get together and say, okay, this one woman's going to cook for us. We're going to, all chip in and pay for her or something, right? Even if she belonged to, somebody, she was somebody's wife or something, right? But we see in the, all throughout the general military correspondence of the day, things that just sort of say okay, make sure that the women are furnished with rations as usual, right? So that, again, there was some debate as to how many women and what the rations were, but this was a completely expected, accepted part of the wartime experience, right? That women would be engaged in this work, this one showing laundry being done, as I said, cooking, mending clothes, sewing clothes, right? Caregiving, right? And in the Morristown National Park, they have done some really fabulous research. So again, put that on your field trip, take the northern tour, go up to Time Mansion, and then go up to the Morristown National Park. The Morristown National Park has actually found evidence of marriages that took place during the various encampments in Morristown, kind of showing, that there were all of these sort of romantic relationships flourishing, right? But they also tell a particular story of this woman, Margaret Johnson, who had accompanied her husband, who had been stationed at Morristown with his regiment in 1777. And she is also someone who later applies for a pension after, her husband dies. She's trying to keep, means of support for herself. And she, records testimony that says that, she stayed with her husband for 2 months, and that there were 12 in the mess to which she was attached. She cooked and washed for the mess while they were there, and she was sort of promised compensation, right? The captain of the unit said that she ought to have $2 per week for what she did. Again, this was the unit of soldiers deciding for themselves that, she was entitled to this compensation, recognizing the work that she was doing, not just for her husband, but for these 11 other men, right? And that, the captain said that he would try to get some out of the individual wages of the Continental soldiers, but as she noted, I never received 1 penny, right? And again, this is by this time, we all know how tough it was for, the saying, not worth a Continental, right? The soldiers were often being paid in Continental dollars, which were subject to such high inflation that money was sort of worthless during this time. But this was something that Johnson was able to sort of use as testimony to say why she deserved, continuing support from the government after, as a widow's pension, right? And it's just really fascinating evidence we have about the work that was being done by these camp followers, not just to support their own individual husbands, but again, the other members of their troops. This is another fascinating image, also at the Museum of the American Revolution, which has a great exhibit, online exhibit. So if you can't get to Philadelphia, just go online and then look at all these wonderful resources. That's where I found this and the West Point image. And this is somebody who was a French person who was in Philadelphia in 1777, who drew, in his words, an exact representation of a wagon belonging to the North Carolina Brigade as it passed through Philadelphia. And we see the wagon, again, with the women in the wagon, the ubiquitous presence of camp followers, right? Now, what's fascinating is we know that they were there, we know that they played essential roles, that they were there throughout the entire war. At first, Washington was not very happy about this. He thought that they, in his own words, were a clog upon every movement, right? That in his mind, the presence of all these women and children slowed down troop movements, made it harder to get around. The wagons were filled with women and children instead of with supplies, right? And so orders that came out in August 1777 say that every method should be used to get rid of all such as are not absolutely necessary. So even there, Washington is not, even as he's complaining about them and how they're, inefficient and a clog, he's not saying we need to get rid of all the women. He's saying, we need to sort of try and trim down the numbers just to those that are absolutely necessary. And then I actually just love this because this kind of reminds me of whenever we look at prescriptive literature, if ever there is something in the 18th century or 19th century saying what you shouldn't be doing, it's because it's happening, right? And so this is such a great example of this. There are orders issued in 1781 saying no women should be riding in the wagons, but we know that the women were riding in the wagons, and we have all of this evidence that the women were riding in the wagons. And so the fact that somebody feels the need to write this and say this shouldn't be happening is proof of how often it was happening, right? Because if it was only happening once or twice, it wouldn't make it into general orders, right? So the very idea that the army is constantly trying to regulate and control and, manage the number of women that are in the army tells you how many women there must have been for it to constantly be, a subject of debate and discussion. And indeed, I could, sit here for hours and tell you all of this compelling evidence I found. In any sort of random correspondence, you will see, here's stuff where Washington is asking about general supplies and provisions, but then at the end he says, P.S., also inform me of the number of rations that are drawn for the women in the camp, right? So this was an issue throughout the war. It was something that was constantly talked about. And indeed, by 1781, there are actually attempts to figure it out for, come up with some official rules, right? So in April 1781, I found a letter that's written to George Washington that says, in every regiment there is a considerable number of women and children, right? It's just everywhere. And so many of them are drawing rations, drawing provisions, that there ought to be, a resolve of Congress or an order or a regulation that tells us, what number of women is allowed, right? So again, this is evidence that there are so many women everywhere, this major general is saying, like, look, give me some guidance, give me some, what's allowed here, right? What is the number that is really necessary, right? That again, absolutely necessary, really necessary, just this attempt to try and quantify how many women, are or should be allowed. And so indeed, in June of 1781, there is a board of general officers that convene and sort of hold this conference. And one of the points that they take up is what number of women ought to be allowed and who should be entitled to rations, right? Because that's really the big sticking point too, is how many rations, how much is it going to cost us to feed all these women and children? And at this meeting that takes place in June of 1781, these people decide that it should be 1 to every 15. Right? Which suggests, again, remember Holly Meyer suggests that maybe it's just 1 to 30, right? But this suggests that there's so much more, right? Because that they are trying to limit it to 1 to 15. And again, I think it varies considerably by, particular regiments and particular campaigns and things like that. But again, this sort of shows you that, this is a recurring issue throughout the war. And indeed, it never really goes away, because as late as 1783, Washington writes to Robert Morris to say that he was obliged to give provisions to the extra women in the regiments, or to lose by desertion, perhaps to the enemy, some of the oldest and best soldiers in the service, right? So, by even as late as 1783, this was still a recurring problem. These efforts to limit the number of women were not working. And when the Army did try to enforce this, there are stories of men who say, well, okay, if you don't let our wives stay, we'll leave. And so this, throughout the entire war, even Washington comes to recognize that he has got to sort of support these women, or else he, is going to lose some of his very best soldiers. And again, he's writing this in 1783 when, for all intents and purposes, most of the military conflict is over, right? Yorktown is a deciding battle, but the war is still raging, and this is still an issue, right? And then there's this brand new early access document on founders.org that goes into even more details about this in 1783. And again, it's still talking March 1783, just months before, peace is being, declared, that, that there's, still more women and children here, right? And that we have to figure out something because, there's still more women than there are, that 1 to 15 that somebody had decided, right? And again, we either have to provide for them or risk the loss of a number of men who very probably would have followed their wives, right? So again, right up to the very end of the war, this continues to be a really key issue, and then reminds us of what a ubiquitous presence women had in these military spaces, right? So the stories of women, using their homes as headquarters remind us of how the war comes to women, but the presence of all these thousands and thousands of camp followers reminds us of how the women came to the war, right? And sort of further blurring those boundaries. On terms of the other side, right, just to sort of, give a shout out to the British as well, approximately 5,000 to 10,000 women are accompanying the British troops. Most of them are accompanying their soldier husbands. Some come all the way from England and travel with their husbands. This has sort of been standard practice in British Army, for centuries, while other soldiers married American women, right? I mean, you have to remember that British soldiers had been quartered and stationed in America, for years now at this point. A good friend of mine from graduate school, Serena Zabin, has written about the Boston Massacre as a family history, because so many of the soldiers that were involved in the troops that were there had married American women and sort of had embedded themselves into the community. And so you have to imagine that when war does break out, either the British soldiers or American loyalist men, if they have wives, the wives are joining and doing the work of camp followers, just like they did for the American troops, right? Providing this essential labor, sewing, laundry, cooking, nursing, right? And we do have a couple of really spectacular visual representations from the British side that just sort of show how common and, again, ubiquitous. So this is a 1780 engraving of a British encampment that's held at Brown University. And if you look closely, you can just sort of see like there are women everywhere. And so we see women over here, we see a woman over there, we see women over here, even this one's holding a child, right? There's some more women in the back there. So again, just kind of proving with the, not just the written records that we have, all the military orders and personal accounts in writing, but we do have some really spectacular visual representations that also show that the presence of women are an everyday occurrence in both American and British encampments at the time. And then this is from slightly later, from 1785. But again, it just sort of shows how military encampments for the British Army would have always included women and children, that this was just an expected part of 18th century military life for the British. Now, in terms of British camp followers, a significant number of members of British camps were enslaved individuals, both men and women, who flew to the British lines for protection. In 1775, Lord Dunmore, the Royal Governor of Virginia, issues a proclamation saying any individuals who kind of come join our side will be granted their freedom. And it's not just men who take up arms against the British. They come with women, they come with children, and a lot of those women who do flee to the British are put to work by the British as laborers, as cooks, as nurses, as servants, right? So you have, a sort of, and there are some scholars who are really just starting to really study this in depth, and I really sort of look forward to what they come up with, because again, it's another example of these sort of hidden histories that are now being recovered. And I found a couple of runaway slave ads. When we think about runaway enslaved individuals, we often presume that these are men, but we know that during the American Revolution, a higher proportion of women chose to run away as well, because again, during the American Revolution, a lot of enslaved individuals aren't just running away, they are running towards the protection of the British Army, and that makes such a big difference in terms of increasing their chances for success. And so these are two examples of women who make their escape during the war. And in the one on the top left, actually says that she does right after the surrender of Yorktown. So she's sort of taking advantage of the chaos and confusion of war. Presumably, if it's happening right after the surrender, she might have been joining the British Army and sort of fleeing, with their surrender and sort of seeking the protection of the army to make her escape. And then the one on the bottom right, again, ran away with the last of British troops from the city of Philadelphia, is another woman who uses, the troop movements of British troops to make her own escape, and presumably, again, would have then had the protection of the British Army. It's much easier to run away and find freedom if you are doing so along with thousands of other people instead of trying to make your escape alone with very few provisions and food and everything else. So it's really remarkable how many, not just men, but also enslaved women take advantage of wartime and use the British troops who are offering them freedom and opportunity to help increase their chances for success. And then I can't go to Trenton and talk about women's roles without talking about the ladies of Trenton, right? And so we have this wonderful story of these women, and there's another one of these cards, Mary Daggerty, right? And so the ladies of Trenton are essential to the war effort during the war itself. They engage in a fundraising activity to raise supplies. They raise over $15,000, which Mary Daggerty, as one of the leaders of the Ladies of Trenton, sends directly to George Washington. And the Ladies of Trenton, it should also note, is a statewide campaign. It's actually remarkable in a world without, social media. They are able to get women from all counties, Huntington, Suffolk, Bergen, which it is indeed Hester Dye and who was one of the Ladies of Trenton, right? So they're collectively known as the Ladies of Trenton, but the Ladies of Trenton is a statewide organization to fundraise and provide support The money is mostly used to make clothes because this is a persistent problem that the Continental Army has, is feeding and clothing their troops. And so Mary Daugherty and other women of the Ladies of Trenton are essential in those elements. And I actually have a former master's student, Catherine Hudak, who has written a whole article about the Ladies of Trenton. I know she spoke in Trenton several years ago. She's absolutely fabulous. If you want to know more, bring her back. And then when Washington is making his inaugural journey to take up his presidency, Trenton is also one of his stops. And it is, again, the Ladies of Trenton, many of the same women who organized the fundraising, who help create this elaborate arch and welcome for him. And there's this fabulous article that is in the Trenton Historical Society's archive about how George Washington, as he's making his way through Trenton en route to take up, his post as the first president of the United States, has to stop and sort of thank the Ladies of Trenton for this beautiful, warm welcome. And I love how he says, the astonishing contrast between his former and current situation here, how beautiful it is for him to have this moment where he gets to come full circle from the early days in Trenton, 1776, to now making his way through Trenton as he's about to, take up the presidency, and how it is the women who greeted him and provided him with such a warm welcome, and how important that was. And sort of yet another reminder of how important women were to the war effort, and particularly right here in Trenton. I could go on forever, but I want to make sure I have time for questions and stuff, so I'm going to leave it there, and thank you all so much. Question up front.
I'm assuming there were many children there. Was there any accommodations for them for learning and teaching? And
no, I mean, it's the middle of a war, so no, nothing formal, right? It was more sort of catch can, what you would do in the hours when you were, life in an encampment. A lot of it is just tedious and boring, right? So
the children being taken care of.
Yeah, they're just. I mean, there's nothing, at least like that would not have been something that, we have to, because part of the problem is we have to rely on the sources that are available, right? We don't have any camp follower women like writing their diaries saying, hey, here I am teaching my kid their ABCs. Like that. Those were not conditions that were conducive, whether or not these women even had enough literacy or supplies to keep a diary, right? There's all of those things. So the way that 18th century women camp followers come to us is through these other sources, right? Visual representations of them, the military writing about them, maybe soldiers are writing about them, and their concerns are the rations and the, either how useful these women are or how much of a nuisance these women are, right? You have very, they're not going to prioritize, is anyone, what about the children? That just isn't what the people who would have been writing. And unfortunately, we have so few 18th century accounts by women directly about the war, but we have almost none, from camp followers themselves. So the sources just don't survive, And those would have been the women who would have cared about that and would have been doing something about that, but we just don't have their first-person accounts.
So just on the topic of children, at that time, if I'm right, children of working-class families didn't go to school. They learned what they could at home. They were taught a trade or whatever. So they probably wasn't all that different, except for they were mobile. They were constantly moving. But I also wanted to say one thing about the Ladies of Trenton. So John Cox had 6 daughters, and they and his wife, whose name I can't remember now, Esther, were one of the people in charge of organizing the arch and the throwing of flowers in front of,
But they were also with the early fundraising, because in this ad it says unanimously appointed Mrs. Cox, Mrs. Dickinson, Mrs. Furman, and Mrs. Caldwell. So she was one of the top leaders of the fundraising efforts as well. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned officers, both on the British and on the Royalists, on the Rebel side. Would none of them have? Sam mentioned, the working class.
Right.
But if you were a member of the officer corps, would you have not had someone? Those enslaved people were managing and taken care of. doing something on an educational level. for
The
you.
officers would have been much less likely to have their children, right? The officers' wives who flitted in, came for a few weeks or a month to stay during the military encampments. They rarely brought their children with them because they had somebody back home who could take care of their children, the enslaved individual or the servant there. Or there's even evidence of when soldiers come from England to America, they leave their children behind. They stay with family members, even if the wife comes with them, right? So for the officers, they had more options, right? The officers' wives weren't there out of economic necessity, and that's why the children were there as well, because otherwise the family had no place to go, right? With the officers' wives, they were just there for a visit, so they very rarely brought their children with them, and so whatever education was happening to those children would have been happening, in their own homes, or there is one of the cards, which I don't have up here, right, is someone who's actually in Trenton at the time attending a boarding school, right? So the opportunities would have been there for wealthier families, but they wouldn't have been, as part of the camp experience. They would have been taking place, at home or at a boarding school somewhere else along the way.
Thank you.
No, thank you all so much.